Good morning. We have a fascinating session. Jeff Gordon is going to talk about a role for institutional investors playing as stewards that is not familiar in the literature and was not covered in the first session. And we've got a remarkable panel to do this. For things like this, it's really very useful to have both the Beatles and the entomologists on one panel. We have representatives of two of the three largest asset management groups. We have a $145 billion state pension fund represented. On the small side, I've been the independent chair of a family of mutual funds that on a good week is probably around 200 billion. I want to take the 2 minutes I have, and everyone should take a look at the program because the panel participants, quite remarkable careers are described there. I want to take just 2 minutes to talk about the dynamics of the asset management industry. What we have a tendency to talk about the industry as if we were taking a snapshot. The industry is in my view, is in the process of a significant change, and that change is consolidation. And if we just look over the last, I don't know, 6 months or so, we've got Franklin Templeton and Legg Mason combining, generating roughly $1.2 trillion of assets under management. You've got Morgan Stanley getting back into business by buying Eaton Vance, another $1.2 trillion. Nelson Peltz has taken roughly a 10% stake both in Janus Henderson, who had combined 2 years ago, and Invesco. That'll generate another $1.2 trillion block of assets under management. Wells Fargo announced yesterday that their $578 billion worth of AUM is on the block. And Jamie Dimon, not to be left out, 2 days ago announced that while they don't have anything on the table, they're looking at acquisitions. That's asset under management. If you also think about the other side of the business, the distribution channels, just as an example, Schwab's acquisition of TD Ameritrade was approved by the Justice Department. So it's not just that the first derivative of concentration is positive. The second derivative of concentration is also positive. And that background, the conversation about stewardships, the conversation about what institutional investors do, at least needs a background, the simple background of what's going on in the industry that all of them are engaged with. So what we're going to do, Jeff, you have about 20 minutes. Then each of the commentators will have 10 to 12, and then we will have some time left for Jeff, for you to respond and to engage questions from the others of us who are here.
Great, thank you. Okay, so got a 2 screens set up here. So the slide has really got the talk in a nutshell. Oh, wait, here's the intro. Oh, right, that's the title. Now, the goal of what I've written is to provide a foundation for a form of engagement by large investors and managers with their portfolio firms that both fits their theory of investing and their low-cost business model. And I call this approach systematic stewardship. The obvious audience is the broad-based index fund designed to follow the performance of the market as a whole while minimizing fees, even zero fees. But systematic stewardship can also serve as a guide to any large investor where it's pursuing a strategy of wide-scale diversification and to reduce cost as much as it can. So the core idea is this. The insight of modern portfolio theory, which is really the foundational strategy for asset management, is that investors' utility takes count of both risk as well as expected returns, so that what investors want to maximize is risk-adjusted returns. Therefore, investors compete to create diversified portfolios to eliminate risk and are generally paid for bearing only that risk which cannot be diversified away. The risk that pertains to a particular firm's so-called idiosyncratic risk can be diversified away. Risk that will affect returns throughout the portfolio, systematic risk remains. So this is a critical difference with some of what the prior panel discussed. Engagements that may improve firm-specific performance generally are idiosyncratic. They will not improve the performance of the portfolio as a whole. Now, the possible exception requires the assumption that such engagements are part of a pattern designed to produce what I call governance externalities that lifts the performance of all firms on average that will produce economy-wide effects. The straightforward implication of this is that advisors of extensively diversified portfolios, especially the broad-based index funds, should focus on addressing the systematic risk elements in their portfolios rather than new efforts into firm-specific performance-focused engagement. Now, this can mean different things. It could mean voting in support of a management of a systemically important financial firm in a face-off with hedge funds who want the firms to take greater risk to enhance the shareholders' return. As the events of 07-09 vividly illustrated, the failure of a SIFI can result in losses across the entire portfolio. In deciding whether to support the risk-loving hedge fund, the index fund investor ought to consider not only the return proposal at the single firm, but the systemic risk effect. Because portfolio theory shows us that investors in the index fund are seeking to maximize risk-adjusted returns, and so that assessment of systematic risk effects become even more important in this case than the impact on single firm returns, an idiosyncratic effect. So a salient form of systematic risk, of course, is climate change risk. The disruptions associated with various moments of this risk will reflect across the entire economy, across an entire diversified stock portfolio. Climate change risk is systematic, and failure to reduce it will thus reduce risk-adjusted returns for an index fund investor. So here is the importance for a portfolio theory perspective. Many arguments for a climate-sensitive engagement entail a trade-off between expected returns and the social value of avoiding the potential for severe harms. Socially responsible investing. Systematic stewardship grounds engagement to reduce this risk in the economics of investor welfare. The goal of such engagement is to lower systematic risk and thus to improve risk-adjusted returns for the investors in the fund. There is no trade-off of investor welfare for social welfare. Now, in a sense, there's nothing new in the claim that diversified investors should and do, in fact, take a portfolio approach towards their engagement activities. For example, such investors have developed a model of good governance expressed in guidelines that generate voting positions across the entire portfolio. For example, these investors commonly reject classified boards, want annual say on pay, want a single class common, and sometimes supported by empirical evidence, and other times by just a view about the managerial accountability to shareholders. Such investors believe that the adoption of these positions will increase the value of the firm on average. And then these views are applied in a relatively uniform way across the portfolio, even though a firm-specific analysis would surely produce governance heterogeneity to a greater extent than we see. Surely some firms would benefit from relative stability associated with a staggered board. The typical response is yes, bespoke governance might be better, but given the cost, including follow-up monitoring required by such tailoring, it's the uniformity approach that will increase expected returns across the portfolio as a whole. Now, Systematic also takes a portfolio approach. The distinctive twist is the focus is not on how to increase expected returns across the portfolio, but how to reduce systematic risks and thus how to enhance risk-adjusted returns across the portfolio. It's not just an additive approach. Indeed, there may be a trade-off with expected returns. Going back to the SIFI case, a diversified investor caring about systematic risk may have a different approach to risk taking by a large financial firm and may favor rather than disfavor government rules that constrain that risk. It may regard its risk-adjusted returns as enhanced rather than reduced by measures that reduce expected returns across that part of the portfolio. In short, systematic stewardship provides a finance-based framework for the assimilation and assessment of many concerns that fly under the flag of ESG, environmental, social, and governance matters. And some concerns, climate change, for example, get quick take up by systematic stewardship, sorry, but others perhaps not. And so a systematic perspective will be a framework to analyze in a more specific way those parts of ESG that maybe a fund should focus on and otherwise not. So the claim here is that the stewards of diversified funds should devote their engagement especially to thinking about the portfolio-wide effects and especially systematic implications in their use of the governance tools. But it's not only an obligation from the beneficiary point of view and their comparative advantage because it actually fits with the economic core of their investment management strategy. But insofar as investors are drawn to funds that advance ESG concerns while not giving up on risk-adjusted returns, the index funds may find that it's a persuasive point of competitive advantage. Asset managers can market their systematic stewardship stance as a way of trying to distinguish themselves from other index funds and thereby to increase assets under management. So again, I just want to on slide 2, the critical point for me is there is not a trade-off from doing well and doing good in this sense. Once you take account of systematic risk and the importance to reduce it and thinking about risk-adjusted returns, we're not dealing with socially responsible investing, but finance theory. in the effort to improve the welfare of the investors in the portfolio. So, I've got limited time. I want to focus on a few things. One of which is the connection is about systematic risk, and basically part of the point here is that the CAPM model does have, even in the various versions of it that add more factors, FAMA, French, et cetera, it still has a sort of a market risk element to it. And part of what I suggest by way of actions that index funds can take is the effort to force disclosure, whether at the individual firm level or even through the SEC, to force disclosure on various activities in which the firms engage in that affect the systematic risk that they bring to the party, and also the extent to which they're affected by the systematic risk. If there's better disclosure, then we can get a better price for these firms. We can get systematic risk priced in a more specific way as to the systematic risks in question, and thereby the market itself will bring pressure on these firms to reduce the systematic risk that may exist within the way that they do business. A second point I want to make here is the case against index fund engagement in firm-specific stewardship designed to enhance the performance of the firm. The key point is that an index fund, unlike an actively managed fund, can't achieve a return by firm-specific performance engagement. By definition, if you've diversified fully, then any performance change is going to be idiosyncratic. It's not going to move. It's not going to move the needle, and it will not be valued by investors. It won't improve the performance of the portfolio. And so, that's thinking about Professor Lund's point, that's a complex issue, but I think it has to be appreciated. And for example, there's an example of potentially an intervention against Apple, a large cap stock, obviously, which is going to have performance effects, and that in theory ought to provide, if you have 5% of Apple, that's a very large amount of money, a 5% improvement in the stock price. Well, that's meaningful. Your fees ought to go up because the AUM ought to go up. It doesn't work that way. If the portfolio is diversified, most of the gains associated with Apple are going to come at the expense of Google or Microsoft or Intel. And so you actually are not going to be able to improve the performance of the portfolio as a whole. The second point is that the index funds can take the beneficiary, are the beneficiaries of, in effect, a governance ecology in which they can afford to be responsive, not active, but responsive, reticent, as Ron and I put it once, with respect to performance proposals that are teed up by others. The index funds have no comparative advantage for firm-specific performance engagement. The hedge funds, who devote incredible energy to figuring out specific funds, have that comparative advantage. At most, the index fund should be responsive to these other proposals. And the critical point here is that of governance externalities. implicit in Lucia's claim is that there is an undersupply of this sort of stewardship. I don't see the case for that. If anything, we think that the governance pressure that already exists in the market leads firms to behave in short-termist way. I'm just not. I disbelieve that asking the index funds to do that would improve the state of the world. So, what are the kinds of risks that count as systematic, perhaps? One of which, of course, is climate change risk. Another of which is financial stability risk. And another is social stability risk. I don't really have time to unwind the story. It's there in the text, which you can look at. But the key point is modern portfolio theory, diversification has transformed not only the way investors invest, but how firms are structured. And the shift in structure, which means firms are not really diversified, but are focused, means that there has been a risk shift in favor of the shareholders who can diversify, and against employees who really can't, and who, because firms are now not diversified in response to the shareholder objectives, are going to be imposing greater risk of business failure on the employees. And I think that's a very deep issue that goes to the kind of systematic risks that these funds need to contend with, and society as well. The final point I want to make is really about the common ownership critique. So putting aside the empirics, which maybe are debatable, the concern is that these funds acting in some way collectively are exerting power in a way that the antitrust laws ought to take account of. A couple points. First, the way that I'm proposing that these firms express their systematic concerns is essentially reactive. It's responsive. There are many ESG-focused intermediaries in the market with various proposals by which firms may reduce systematic risk. The point is, the funds will be in a position to evaluate them. This is similar to a model that Ron and I have about how hedge funds work. But basically, there's plenty of intermediaries, ESG intermediaries, setting up proposals for the large funds to evaluate. And it is right that that's the way it goes, because this argument that these funds should engage in greater firm-specific stewardship is going to give up the main defense that they have to antitrust, which is to say, we have no channel through which this collusive activity could occur. The more firm-specific engagement that State Street does, the greater their exposure to antitrust concerns, I think. But the second point is that the welfare effects here of engagement on systematic concerns are not the concerns that the antitrust laws should care about, because the goal is not to engage in monopolization or to extract from consumers for the benefit of the shareholders. Rather, it's to reduce risk, not only through the portfolio, but throughout the economy as a whole. And so, in effect, given that everybody participates in the economy as a whole, the activity here to reduce systematic risk and thereby avoid the negative impact will be an increase in the welfare of everyone, whether or not they are the shareholders in these firms. So I think I'll stop.
The first commentator is Roy Cameron, head of investment stewardship in the Americas at BlackRock, and sort of running the show that Jeff is talking about changing.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of BlackRock. I thought that it would be helpful to kind of level set in terms of kind of how we see the world through BlackRock's eyes, and also to just kind of give a sense of kind of how we think about the world. First of all, when we think about the work that the team does, the investment stewardship team does, it is viewed as an investment function. The team bridges various portfolio management groups and aims to deliver meaningful value to our clients through a range of activities. We've talked about the evolution of governance a little bit, or earlier today there were conversations around that. Engagement and relationship management with portfolio companies, proxy voting, market updates, and engaging in the public policy debate. When we think about the work that we do it through this lens of long-term value creation, and it was something that was just referred to. And that is this focus on the fact that the stewardship work that we do, it is for the index side of the organization. When you think about the assets that BlackRock has under management, the equity assets are about half of the total assets under management. And the equity assets, they represent about $3.5 trillion. Of that, more than 90% of it is oriented in index strategies. And so the work that we do is really focused on that. So we are long-term investors. Typically, the clients that we're representing, the funds are related to retirement or college savings. And so it's really long-term in nature, sometimes in decades. And so we use our voice to advocate for practices and governance practices that encourage long-term sustainability. And we do that by engaging with companies to talk about risk mitigation and risk management strategies. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit more detail. Just to give you a sense of kind of scale in terms of the work that we do, we voted on over 16,000 shareholder meetings and on approximately 150,000 proposals in the last voting season. And we held over 3,000 engagements on a global basis. And we also presented at over 150 conferences and public events on a global basis. There are different strategies in terms of how to attack the investment stewardship business. We have a very dedicated team on a global basis. We operate out of 7 offices. We have over 45 members on our team on a global basis. We are in 85 voting markets. We have the largest dedicated stewardship team in the industry. And I think it's interesting to really focus on the composition of those teams, particularly on a regional basis. The composition is about a third in terms of geographical footprint. And in the US and EMEA in particular, we have sector-focused specialists who are not only responsible for engaging with the companies, they're also responsible for voting. In addition to that, we do have active portfolio managers, which represent, a smaller portion of the assets under management. But that expertise is very important to us, and we leverage that in terms of having joint meetings with companies and really try to understand holistically where companies are in terms of their corporate life, and again, how they are mitigating risk. So 2 principal things that we focus on, again, are engaging with companies and also using our vote. And on the voting, on the engagement side, I just wanted to highlight the engagement priorities, because sometimes, there is a question is when you think about engagement, what exactly are you talking to companies about? And there are 5 engagement priorities for us. These are refreshed every year, but typically the core of them remains the same. Probably won't be a surprise that board quality is very important to us. Environmental risk and opportunities, corporate strategy and capital allocation, compensation that promotes long-termism, and human capital management. Now, so I would highlight that you can certainly pull those priorities up into this very, very common, ESG framework. We spend a lot of time focusing on board quality because evidence has shown that if you have the right people in the seat at the board level, they tend to exercise their responsibilities in terms of overseeing management. And in addition to that, they tend to make better decisions, which the board in and of itself at its core is a decision-making body. So wanted to highlight that, and also wanted to do a little bit of a breakdown just in terms of votes in this last voting season. So there was some conversation just in terms of holding directors accountable, and I just wanted to put a spotlight on that. That is certainly one of the focuses of ours. And we voted against over 5,000 directors at over close to 2,800 companies, driven by concerns regarding director independence, insufficient progress on board diversity, and overcommitted directors as well. Just to put some numbers around that, just for clarity, lack of director independence, we voted against over 1,700 directors. For insufficient diversity, we voted against over 1,600 directors. And for overboarding, we voted against 728 directors. In terms of engagements, I just wanted to drill down in that a little bit as well. The engagements themselves, just to give a bit of a breakdown, over 3,000 engagements, and in environmental in particular, and you may recall that at the beginning of the year, Larry talked about climate risk being investment risk. So we certainly upped the number of engagements that focused on environmental and risk, as well as opportunities. So in that space, we had over 1,200 engagements, which was a 300% increase on a year-over-year basis. In the social category, which is obviously critically important, particularly around human capital management and supply chain management, et cetera, the increase was 173%, coming in 965 engagements. And in the G category, governance, which continues to be the linchpin, over 2,800 engagements there, representing a 40% or close to a 50% increase. So I thought that level setting would be helpful in terms of the conversations that we have going forward.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
I think we'll save the questions for the end, because I think what's going to be interesting is the questions are going to cross-cut everybody who's on the panel. The next commentator is Patrick Bolton, who's a professor of economics at the Columbia Business School, and just to tie his work into the subject matter of the panel, he has also written a wonderful piece which generates a portfolio management technique that has the promise of reducing the carbon footprint on the order of about 40% without costing on the performance against the benchmark. So Patrick's got his hand in both worlds. Patrick.
Thank you, Ron. I have prepared a few slides, so let me share my screen. In the interest of time, jump right in to my presentation. Like Jeff in his presentation, I have two screens in front of me, so I hope I won't be too confused by this. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for putting me on this panel. I really enjoyed reading the piece by Jeff Gordon on systematic stewardship. My comments will, if you want, will to a large extent be in line with the main argument that Professor Gordon is making in his article. So what I will do is start with the counter argument, the critique of his argument, and then I will offer a counter argument, which will take a broader perspective than he's taking. And then in the end, I want to return to the dilemma that he raised in his final remarks. Yeah. So you didn't miss much. I gave you the outline. And so now let me dig into my comments. So the counter argument. So this is a bit of a dry academic point here, but it's important to get this out of the way. You know, the neoclassical perspective, which we've lived with until very recently in corporate governance, it says, you know, when it comes to systematic risk, well, you know, to use a term that's now become popular, it is what it is. You take it and you accept it. And if there's something to be done by financial markets is to price the systematic risk correctly. It's a pricing problem, not a governance problem. Okay, that's the first point. Now, There may be externalities. Climate change and carbon emissions are the prime example. But here the neoclassical perspective says, well, externalities, business can deal with it. And we have a very fundamental idea in law and economics, the Coase theorem, which says that, all you need to do is allocate property rights. And once property rights are properly allocated, externalities will be internalized through bargaining. This idea, of course, has reached its limits, especially when it comes to climate change. Doesn't work in this particular example. And so then what do we do when the Coase theorem doesn't work? Well, here's the other part of the neoclassical analysis. It says, well, we have a division of labor. Externalities are a matter of public policy, and the private sector is dealing with making money. Okay, I was at a recent, not so recent actually, a few years ago, there was a corporate governance event at Colombia, and Steve Ratner was on the panel, and he made exactly that argument. He said, private sector should worry about making money. Any other aspects are a matter of public policy. And public policy is about setting the rules, enforcing them, and then private sector is about playing, competing under those rules. And if there's a problem left for corporate governance, it's one about solving a principal agent problem between the executives of the company and the shareholders who are trying to make sure that executives maximize shareholder value. Okay, that's the counter argument. What about the counter argument? The counter argument, and here I'm taking a broader perspective than what's taken in the article. The counter argument is that politics is broken. The division of labor doesn't work. Public sector is not dealing with externalities. And if you're faced with a situation where the public sector isn't doing its job, what do you do? What do you do when public policy fails to address the systematic risk? That's the problem. And I think we all understand when it comes to climate change, business as usual is not an option. And I can't think of a better way of making that point as an old cartoon from the New Yorker. Some of you may have seen it. I think it makes this point succinctly and beautifully. And here it is. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. I think that's the problem we're in today. And in preparing my remarks, I couldn't think of anything better to do than going back to Al Gore's book, An Inconvenient Truth, and to state, the nature of the problem we're dealing with. Here's what he says in the middle of the book. We are witnessing an unprecedented and massive collision between our civilization and the earth. So that's really the magnitude of the challenge. And I couldn't resist taking out two quotes of Mark Twain that he has in the book. One is, of course, very pertinent to what we're discussing. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. That's a problem we've been facing very widely, both in the political sphere and in the governance sphere. And the second quote is purely gratuitous, but it was too good not to put on the slide. Denial ain't just a river in Egypt. So that's the point. And another way of putting the general argument is one that I heard David Pitt Watson make he's the former head of UNEP-FI. This was at a conference in preparation for the Paris Accord. And he said, when it comes to climate change, we're all players. We're not spectators. And that's really the point. So we're all players here, and asset managers are players, corporations are players, banks are players, other investors are players, central banks are players, asset owners are players. And this is, echoing remarks that Ray Cameron made just earlier. Asset owners are a big part of what's driving the change here. They are coming with mandates. They want climate change to be taken seriously, and they are pushing asset managers to move in that direction. So the general point is that the question is not whether asset managers must engage to combat climate change, but how they can engage most effectively. That's what we really need to discuss going forward. There are plenty of things to touch on here, but I won't have time to do that. But let me close by touching on the final point that marks. That's the balance that the asset manager will face. And the point is that to be effective, engagement requires coordinated action among asset managers and between institutional investors and regulators. And that creates a risk of running afoul of antitrust laws. So I would urge Professor Bolton to really develop that point more and say to what extent we can avoid facing that dilemma, and where the limits are in engagement, asset management world engagement, and how this, where do we collide with the antitrust world? So that will be all for me, and let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Patrick. Next, the next speaker is William McNabb, retired from Vanguard in 2018 after holding basically the highest positions in the organization, and he's a Milstein Center advisory board member. So he's seeing it both from as inside as you could imagine, and now from the outside.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And Jeff, I just want to commend you on your paper. It's really thoughtful. It's one of the more innovative and sort of fresh ways of thinking about the problem. I will confess I haven't shown it to the Vanguard team since I just got it, and I'm dying to hear what my former colleagues at Vanguard think about it. And I'm really anxious to see you finish fleshing it out and get to the conclusions. But at a high level, I think it at least provides some real thought-provoking content for us to go through. To frame my perspectives on Jeff's paper, I think just a little bit of context is helpful. As you just heard, I'm retired from Vanguard, so my views are going to be my views, not Vanguard's views, but they're certainly going to be influenced by my 32 years there, where we had both index and active equity strategies. And in particular, it's going to be influenced by a couple of things about, being part of Vanguard really, reinforces with you as an investor or as a leader. And first and foremost, and this came up in the first panel quite a bit, but we never, ever, ever, ever forget when we're thinking about governance that this is not our money. And I think that's been lost in a lot of the literature. Now, Lucian actually went pretty deep on it, and I'll have a couple of comments on that later. But the idea that it's not our money certainly influenced all of our thinking in terms of how to respond to governance challenges and so forth. And again, unlike many of the other firms that you're going to hear from, our mix is almost all retail. I think of Vanguard's asset base, 98% is in the hands of an individual investor, either directly, just Vanguard.com, through a financial advisor, or as part of a 401k plan. The other 2% would be DB plans, endowments, and foundations, where we're kind of an outsourced CIO for them, but it's a relatively small fraction. And I do think how you think about this really differs if it's your money versus you're really speaking on behalf of beneficial investors. The other contextual thing just to put out there is just like a 2-minute version of history. You know, if you go back to the 1960s, when 90% of the equity markets in the US were owned directly by retail investors and only about 10% by professional investors, there was no such thing as governance. No one talked about it. No one thought about it. It never came up in any dialogues. Boards were essentially, you know, friends and family of management teams, et cetera, you know, with the exception of just a handful of, you know, the largest, best run companies. But for the most part, that's what you saw. You know, as the democratization of the markets through funds in particular took place in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, obviously you saw a shift from direct retail ownership to indirect ownership through funds. And that really began to obviously change the landscape. But even as little as 15 years ago, 2005, no one was really talking about governance in the asset management world except a few academics and a handful of activists. We at Vanguard at that point in time had seen some really nasty proxy fights. And what was at the heart of the issue in those proxy fights was really what's the right time frame to make judgments, and it really was a short-term versus long-termism, if you will, question. And not saying that one particular side or the other of the argument was correct, but one of our conclusions at that point in time was longer-term views were getting shorter shrift. And the evidence for that was, you know, the nature of some of the proxy fights, but it was also in the data, there was an inexorable march in terms of active equity fund managers towards shorter and shorter holding periods. And you can see this in the portfolio turnover data, and it's really, really clear. I bring that up because that short-term versus long-term was actually one of the catalysts for us stepping back as a firm and trying to rethink what governance might look like. And it really was, you know, the acknowledgement that, especially in our index funds, we are forever shareholders. You know, you own the stock as long as it's in the index. And we wanted boards of directors to know that we were much more interested in short-term or in long-term value creation and much less interested, frankly, not at all interested in short-term, you know, the short-term ups and downs of this particular company's stock or the marketplace in general. So again, I give you that just as context because it does inform, you know, how I'm going to sort of respond to Jeff's paper. So, in no particular order, just a few observations. So, you know, one. Jeff, I'm going to commend you. It's a well done paper, and the history that you lay out is actually, I think, very, very, very useful and has actually been missing from some of the dialogue. The fundamental application of modern portfolio theory is new and innovative, and I think it's actually a very useful lens. I need to think through the implications a little bit more. You know, it's interesting, again, if I put on my retail shareholder hat in particular, risk-adjusted returns in individual products is never really part of the conversation. We really think about, or they think about, risk-adjusted returns much more as in asset class diversification, if you will, as the source of, or asset class, you know, mixture being the source of diversification. And it's risk-adjusted returns are really much more at the portfolio level in terms of the focus, as opposed to the individual product. That doesn't make the argument any less salient, but I do want to think through those, you know, just those implications. You know, as I was reading the paper, you know, one of the fundamental question I stepped back and asked myself is, you know, what problems are we trying to solve in all of these discussions? And as I already alluded to, for us originally, short-term versus long-term thinking was certainly topic number one. I would say topic number two for us was misalignment of incentives, some of which has to do with timeframes, but it also had to do with success and performance. And then more recently, I would say topic number 3 in terms of a problem is board composition. And here, I would say, and I'll come back to this in a minute, board composition more as a risk mitigant as opposed to a return enhancer, although there is a mix, again, to be fair. So when as I read through the paper, before I get to that, as I think about what were the problems we were trying to solve through governance, if I had to sort of come up with a phrase, I would say we're trying to make the system better, right? We're trying to improve the overall system. And I think Professor Gordon would argue that's a mixture of risk reduction, but also in return enhancement. So, there's a mixture going on. And of course, this paper focuses much more on the risk reduction elements. The good news, I think, in terms of sort of practical implications of the paper are, I think there's actually a movement in this direction happening naturally. And I think what the paper may end up doing for us is giving us a little bit sharper focus and make us ask some tougher questions of ourselves as we continue to march forward on this governance journey. And the evidence I would ascribe to that would be 3 or 4 points. So one, when you look at the evolution of governance principles from the very beginning, when the so-called Buffett-Diamond corporate principles were issued, and what ISG put forth and so forth, I think as you've watched those progress, you've actually seen much more of a mix between what you might term return enhancers with risk reducers. And so there's more balance there. Second, when I look at all the big asset managers, whether it's index or active, there is a renewed focus on board composition. And Richard from State Street brought this up. I actually think it's one of the things that this dialogue we could go a lot deeper on. Maybe it's another seminar, but to me, it's actually at the heart of everything. And getting better board governance is really what this is all about. The shareholders elect directors, but directors are really standing in and are that interface between management and the ultimate owners of the company, and their role is incredibly critical here. And there's a lot of work going on in terms of board composition. And I would argue much of this is much more around reducing risk. Jeff and I had a chance to talk about this a little bit beforehand. And, if you looked at some of the diversity elements of board composition, I would actually put those more in the return enhancement category, because what you're seeing there is just a broader pool. And, hopefully a broader pool leads to better quality. But on the risk reduction side, we're seeing a real pivot in terms of the emphasis of the shareholders around what kinds of skills and experiences do different directors bring. And you're seeing much more discussion around domain expertise and how to bring that to bear in terms of oversight, as well as a real mix of technical skills. So again, we can come back to that in the Q&A if people are interested in, but I do think it's evidence that, again, there's this sort of movement toward, I will call it a systematic approach. Jeff in his paper uses ESG, and in particular climate disclosure, as an example of what might be a candidate for systematic risk reduction. I would say at least the activities that I've seen both inside boardrooms where I sit, as well as investors on the outside, it's all about disclosure and, in a sense, trying to give the marketplace much broader risk disclosure so that the risks can be more properly assessed. And again, that feels to me already to be headed in a much more systematic way. And again, we can talk about how to take it to the next step. And then finally, there is work being done right now by a number of groups to really promote long-termism, whether it's FCLT, focused capital on the long term, or CECP's work, where companies are really being encouraged to share long-term thinking, long-term plans, long-term market dynamics and so forth with investors, as opposed to just the typical quarterly readouts. And I think that is a really good trend. And again, may actually be evidence that some of what Jeff is talking about in his paper is beginning to happen. And then the last thing I wanted to say, and then we can move on, is I can't let the first panel go without at least a couple of points of comment. One, Dr. Lund's ideas around how to solve this, I would just say respectfully, that is an activist hedge fund's dream fantasy. I mean, that to me would be a fantastic outcome if you're an activist hedge fund, to eliminate, in a sense, a longer term view. And the example she used about the 7% decline in the price the next day, that to me is exactly what the issue is. There was a very short term hit to the stock price, but then if you look at the long term value that was created by I call it a more nuanced approach, you end up with maybe a different argument. And quite a few active managers actually voted with management on that. It was not just an index thing. So that's point one. And then point two, as I already alluded to, some of the agency stuff, I think we should be very careful about assuming we know what, I say we, the academic world knows what beneficial investors actually, what they actually want. I can tell you in my travels and seeing data from 25 million individual investors at Vanguard, governance broadly just doesn't come up. So, they're very, very concerned that their funds are being run with a view toward creating the kind of wealth that they're trying to create by being investors. I do think this is where this systematic approach that Jeff talks about, though, has some real appeal, because I also think implicitly many of those beneficial investors would like to see the system continue to improve, so that, again, make no mistake, good governance isn't going to eliminate all failures, all corporate failures. But the hope, I think, is that good governance will reduce, if you will, the severity of some of those tails. Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to, let me just throw one thing out, which people will pick up going forward if they think it's right. We've talked a lot about firm governance. As I listen to what we want funds to do, the first question that comes to my mind is, how do we pay the people in the governance group? How do we pay portfolio managers? What are they actually getting paid to accomplish? And we'll have a view on, we'll have a better sense of that if we know what that is. And I'm not sure there's very good disclosure about how active active mutual fund managers or non-transparent ETF managers are paid, how the governance group is paid. But that would be if we thought of it as a company, it would be the kind of disclosure that we might want. Okay, that may interest people or not, but we want to move to someone who will interest people. Jill Fisch is a chaired professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the co-director of the Institute of Law and Economics, and has written a great deal recently about precisely these kinds of issues. Jill?
Great. Okay, so it's working. Thank you. So again, let me echo everybody's thanks for being here. It's a terrific topic. It's a really impressive group of speakers. I am grateful to be included among them. So I just put up a definition of stewardship, since this is a conference about stewardship. Obviously, we have a huge amount of attention worldwide on institutional investor stewardship. We heard from the earlier panel, and Jeff's paper dovetails very nicely with the earlier panel. Lucian and Scott arguing that institutional investors underinvest in stewardship. I'm still not entirely sure I know what underinvest means. Lucian said at the very end, well, so long as there's a staggered board out there, we know that institutional investors aren't doing enough. I guess I'm not entirely convinced by that definition, but to the extent you think that's a problem, obviously outside the United States, institutional investor stewardship is increasingly a mandate. It's an obligation. And we'll hear later from Dionysia and Dan. They've put together this book that just describes the explosion of stewardship codes and stewardship obligations around the world. So Jeff's paper fits in really well with all of that, right? So stewardship obviously presents challenges, right? As Jeff says very clearly in the paper, look, large diversified investors aren't really a good source of firm-specific operational improvements. Index funds in particular seek to minimize costs, which means it's hard for them to justify significant investments, both in evaluating firms on a firm-specific basis and in engagement. How much money do we really want them to spend, especially since, as a number of commentators have explained, index funds compete primarily on price. Institutional investors, and we heard just a little bit of this from Bill, may face their own agency problems, right? What the portfolio manager or the fund governance committee thinks is socially optimal might not be either what the beneficial owners think is socially optimal or what they want their managers to do with the investors' money. And Jeff alludes to this in his paper, and it hasn't really come out in the discussion. Stewardship may involve, or at least may raise, the question of whether portfolio companies should make decisions that sacrifice economic value in favor of other objectives, like reducing climate change, right? And so I talk about a lot of this in my chapter in Dan and Dionysia's book, which is in the materials. And you know, there are a lot of potential problems. So if stewardship is about voting and engaging, but we don't really trust investors to do it adequately, some people like Dorothy Lund say, well, we conclude, you know, index funds at least shouldn't vote, right? I've got a problem with that. I've got a problem for that because, number one, we lose, right? Then we can sort of wrap up this conference because we lose the potential for stewardship. We leave voting to investors who have potentially more problematic incentives, right? So the debate that Bill referred to between short-term and long-term investors, active managers tend to have a shorter time frame, right? That's a result of more trading by the portfolio managers themselves, more trading by the beneficial owners, and their compensation structure. In addition, voting today, shareholder voting, has exploded into a wide range of issues, right? It's not just shareholder proposals, it's say on pay, it's approval of conflict of interest transactions in a way that often insulates those transactions from judicial oversight. And if you say a big chunk of our investors aren't going to vote, you delegitimize that oversight role of the voting process. So I think that's problematic. Right? So Jeff's project is an attempt to respond to these problems, right? So his motivating question is, can you defend investor stewardship in terms of economic value, right? And he focuses in particular on index funds. His answer is yes, right? And he comes up with this theory of systematic stewardship that's really, I think, transformative, both because he places it within what index funds reasonably can be expected to do, and it's defensible in terms of maximizing fund economic value, right? And the underlying theory is systemic stewardship is about risk mitigation, risks that affect a broad range of the companies within the index funds portfolio, right? And this, therefore, is a defense of index fund engagement that responds to our earlier panel, that responds to some of my earlier critiques, and that also provides a rationale for index funds to focus on certain systematic risks, right? In climate change, we heard from Patrick about climate change. Obviously, that's one of them, right? So let me just break this down into two insights or two sets of insights, right? So number one, index funds can do this, right? Systemic stewardship is within the competence of your index fund, right? Reducing portfolio risk doesn't require that you do a deep dive into individual firms, right? ESG governance initiatives can be defended in terms of their effect on the average firm, right? So Vanguard has a policy of voting against staggered boards. And I asked Glenn Burham once, there's all these mixed empirical studies, there's suggestions that in some cases staggered boards are actually helpful to firms. And he said, well, yes, but on average, on the whole, we think staggered boards reduce firm value. So when Vanguard has this policy, it's not making a firm-specific evaluation that in every case this staggered board is bad. It's saying, on average, this is a way of improving, this is a way of reducing systematic risk, right? What Jeff is describing is not just a theory. It's how index funds currently behave and why it makes sense for them to behave that way, right? So, index funds support, if you look at index fund voting behavior, the initiatives in which we see index funds voting are this kind of, initiatives to support board accountability to shareholders, one share, one vote, annual elections, majority voting, monitoring boards, just what Bill was talking about, and greater environmental disclosures. All of them fit within his model, right? So that's insight number one. Insight number two, right? Not only is this within fund competence, but it makes sense economically. Risk mitigation, it's consistent with index fund incentives, right? A diversified investor seeks to maximize risk-adjusted return. Systematic risk reduces risk-adjusted returns across the investor's overall portfolio, right? This is the economic theory of the paper. And this is an early stage draft, so Jeff hasn't spelled all of this out. I guess I have a couple of questions for him going forward. And one set of questions, I'm not an economist, but I thought that investors were compensated for bearing risk that couldn't be diversified away. To the extent that this is a way of reducing risk, are investors going to continue to achieve the same returns, right? And another way of thinking about this is if you look at the risk-return trade-off, are we simply moving the risk-return mixture along the efficient frontier, or are we doing something that moves the frontier itself? I don't know the answer. I don't think Jeff, at least in the current draft, has fully had the opportunities to spell out his thinking on that, but I'd like to hear more, right? And in particular, right, there's at least the potential that by reducing overall market risk, funds are going to kind of shoot themselves in the foot because we're going to see market returns decrease, right? This is kind of, in an extreme case, it's like moving from an equity portfolio to government bonds. Yes, there's less risk, but there's a lot less return. So it's just a question I have about the theory. So an additional concern, and I've raised this on a number of occasions, is, stewardship sounds great. And Patrick gave us a good defense of stewardship against climate change, right? Bill talked about stewardship to increase board accountability. There's all sorts of issues out there. And what I worry about from an investor perspective is, how does somebody like BlackRock or Vanguard choose which should be the funds and the portfolio firms' priorities, right? Because, you can't be everything to all people. So, how do we balance these things? Where should institutional investors concentrate their time? What I love about the paper is the paper gives us a way of at least grappling with that question, right? The paper says, look, index funds should deal with risks that have broad economic effects, like climate change, like financial stability risk, like social stability risk, right? Those are the things that matter. Those are, for now, the first priorities, right? And in particular, the paper says, you don't have to confront critical trade-offs among these different priorities. And one reason you don't have to do that is there are market forces to bear. Market forces can deal with these trade-offs through capital market discipline, through pricing, so long as markets are efficient, so long as markets are informed, right? So he says, look, it's low-hanging fruit. It's a cheap, easy thing that index funds can do. They can encourage greater disclosure about these key issues, right? And the market can then respond and sort of kick the tires and see if the firm policy is right. So my only concern about that is I worry about economically significant risk disclosures being the subject of firm-specific private ordering, right? If these things really matter, if they're not incorporated in market price, and they should be, what about mandatory disclosure, right? We had private ordering for disclosure in the capital markets for many years. It didn't work very well. Merritt, you've written papers on this topic, right? And the government comes in and says, gee, there has to be mandatory disclosure across the board because the firms that are doing good things are disclosing pretty well, and the lemons are kind of hiding what they're doing. Why isn't that same analysis applicable to systemic risk disclosures? And if it is, shouldn't we focus more on regulation rather than stewardship? So again, this is a draft, right? These are challenges. I'm confident that Jeff can meet these challenges, but it's a terrific topic. It's a terrific concept of responding to and cabining some of the concerns that I think we all have about institutional investors. And I commend Jeff on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Last speaker, and then both questions and interaction among the panel. Theresa Whitmarsh, the Executive Director of the Washington State Investment Board, as I did my little bit of research on the order of about $150 billion under assets across a pretty wide portfolio range, and a member of the board, the advisory board of the Milstein Center. And thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you.
Theresa?
It's tough. It's tough to be the final runner in a long relay race. I'm feeling pressure to run fast and get my comments quickly. But I do want to thank Jeff, first of all, for the opportunity to comment on your paper, and particularly the focus that I was asked to bring to the conversation is examining your concept for fit with current practices of institutional investors. So that hopefully that'll be additive to the conversation. I have both positive observations. I think your concepts are terrific and will add to the evolving practices of ESG risk management and assessment. But I also have some remarks I hope you'll consider as constructive as you continue to flesh out your thoughts. To start, I think your paper does really, in a good way, emphasize the legitimacy and importance of systematic risk as a vital keystone to asset stewardship, and particularly with passive managers. And for the audience sake, we made our decision years ago on equities to be primarily passive. So we're passive in all developed markets. The only place we're active in equities is in emerging markets. And even there, our default is passive unless we can find high conviction managers. So we think with our broad-based index funds, we know that when it comes to systematic risk, we have no choice but to essentially go with the flow of the markets. So I think, Jeff, you provided an interesting framework about how to factor those systematic risks into our investment decision processes. And I think your concepts are timely. We as institutional investors are increasingly asked to factor in externalities into our investment decision process, such as climate risk, social instability, financial stability. And historically, our passive style of investing and our risk models have been unable to adequately address these non-financial risks. I think you also rightly attempt to eliminate the fiduciary conundrum that many of us find over traditional risk-return trade-offs. You do this by placing an importance on the potential material impact systematic risk has on returns, and particularly for those of us who are long horizon investors. So in theory, I really like many of the concepts you present in your paper, but as a practitioner, I think it has some real challenges, and that's going to be primarily what I focus on. So the first challenge, and this will be something that academics can completely relate to, is the absence of data measurement and risk methodologies. The degree of available data and the lack of maturation of measurement and risk assessment on such broad-based ESG issues is really mismatched against the degree of measurement utilized in traditional portfolio management. So if we ever want portfolio managers to pay attention to these things, the measurement tools and the methodologies have to evolve. And climate change certainly represents systematic risk for all of our portfolios, but we also have to admit that we face real challenges in being able to clearly apply the risk reduction framework that is aspirational, not only in the paper, but in society. The disclosures and measurements of data are just not yet advanced enough to fit the full needs of my portfolio managers. And let me give a particular example. Every couple of years, we do update our capital market assumptions, and essentially our CMAs are an important building block into our asset allocation studies. And so essentially our CMAs are our outlook for a particular asset class, the return expectations going forward over a 15-year time period. So our board was very interested in having our risk team figure out if they could build climate risk into the CMAs. In other words, would there be a haircut from climate risk, from systematic climate risk exposure that could get captured and reflected in our CMAs? And bottom line, after working on this for basically a full year with a lot of really smart people working on it, the carefully considered answer from our team was that they could not quantify the systematic risk sufficiently to create any kind of measured certainty. And there's a couple things that were problematic. They could not measure how much our climate risk expectations are already embedded in existing return assumptions. They could not tell how much policy adaptations or industry transition will occur during that 15-year time horizon in response to climate risk and how that could influence return assumptions. And they also could not find models or pathway scenarios that don't suffer from large deviation or gaps in unknown information. So ultimately, the team concluded that CMAs were not the best place to express our concerns about climate risk. In other words, at a systematic level, at least at that point, given that tool, we could not do it. So I think ironically, given Dr. Gordon's suggestion that passive investors focus on systematic risk rather than idiosyncratic, without reliable systematic risk measures, we're left really with idiosyncratic risk reduction strategies as our most viable course of action. For instance, we can intervene through engagement at the portfolio company level through traditional governance practices, which have been talked about already today, such as shareholder proposals related to climate risk disclosure, voting out directors who refuse to be risk aware, engaging our collective voices as institutional investors in broader actions, such as asking policymakers for better disclosure standards. So while we agree climate risk is systemic or systematic, it serves as an example of why with so many non-traditional risks, we can't always just focus on what are the other systematic or idiosyncratic. I also wanted to make a comment on idiosyncratic risk. I think in the global economy, it's increasingly likely that idiosyncratic risk will result in systematic risk over time. And I think it's clear with Dr. Gordon's CFI example that some company-specific risks do transcend into systematic impacts, or at least create catalysts for broad market-wide impacts. And I think if you look at our current stock market and the concentration, the large market cap concentrated in fewer companies, that even gives rise to more concerns about a single company's actions transmitting to the whole market. And I also think it has to do with our digital age. Information moves impulsively, and as we are learning, can be trafficked or manipulated without regard to factual integrity. And that in this context, I'm not sure we can be confident that drawing a line between idiosyncratic and systematic risk will be clear, permanent, or even actionable. So that leads me to kind of my next observation. If we have no choice but to pay attention to idiosyncratic risk, then we also have to engage at that level. And I think the stewardship choices presented by Dr. Gordon in the paper are presented, and I don't think he literally believes this, but they are presented as a binary fork in the road. Choices between firm-specific engagement versus portfolio level actions, corporate governance versus strategic or operational issues, initiatory and proactive actions versus responsive or reactive, acting unilaterally as a sole investor or joining forces with others. But I think in reality, when faced with this sort of multiple choice test of engagements, asset owners must choose all of the above. We often need to deploy all of these strategies. And I think we as investors would resist a framework that would limit that broad array of engagement options that might allow us to address idiosyncratic and systematic risks simultaneously. I think the underlying causes of risk are so complex, and identifying and mitigating those risks requires an entire toolkit of mitigations that we believe work in concert. And again, let's go back to the CFI example. It took multiple players to build risk mitigation into the system post-financial crisis. Policymakers had a role in passing laws limiting leverage, for instance. Regulators worldwide developed stress tests to assess SIFI balance sheet risk. Boards beefed up their risk enterprise and oversight. And investors played an important collective role in each of those parties' actions. Similarly, investors are active individually and collectively on many of the ESG issues and will continue to attempt to influence policy and corporate practice where we see risk to returns. And kind of a final point in terms of where I think I'd like to see Jeff pursue a little more is while we continue to engage in broad risk reduction strategies related to ESG issues, we are not unbounded when it comes to return trade-offs. Dr. Gordon introduces the concept of trading off investment returns in exchange for what I would call theoretical reduction of systematic risk. I say it's theoretical because of the problem of data and meaningful measures. It's hard to know what we're trading off with any kind of precision. And if investors enter into such a bargain without sound risk analysis, let's say we compromise return in exchange for addressing a particular ESG issue, we may enter what we often refer to in our business as a slippery slope and get pulled into a lot of distracting policy debates. No matter how important or good the cause, we as public plan fiduciaries are not in the business of beneficial causes. We are in the business of prudent return optimization, and our currency is measurable risk and return. And as I've just described, measurements are still very imprecise on many ESG issues. I don't think we're free to lean into a cause unless we can demonstrate a sound fiduciary tie. And I think this is a good thing. This binds us to our beneficiaries. It serves as a strong defense against political agendas and other agents who want to access our beneficiaries' funds in order to advance many of their well-intended societal purposes. So I would not suggest that a performance trade-off can be identified and implemented without being grounded in a sophisticated level of risk analysis. It's our view that this level of risk analysis is just not yet available. So a performance trade-off cannot always be accommodated without a potential breach of fiduciary duty. So does that mean we ignore ESG until the measures catch up? Absolutely not. We're committed to pushing for better disclosure. We're committed to the development of non-traditional data and analysis. This is a place where I think big data really comes in. I think there's a lot of non-traditional data out there that can help us take a look at systematic risk. So we are committed to many of the concepts that Jeff has put in his paper, but again, like everything, implementation always has its challenges. What I do agree with fully in the paper, Jeff has identified 4 or 5 really strong asset stewardship principles that we can completely get behind. One is better disclosure equals better stewardship. And companies are moving toward greater and more reasonable disclosure of information. And this can only help all players in the value chain. Better measurement equals informed investment and engagement. So measurement, as measurement methods advance, this inevitably will help us apply ESG factors in a prudent way. Strong governance equals strong E&S, and that's already been talked about by several of the speakers. Governance is kind of a super spreader factor in ESG. By continuing to engage and invest in sound governance practices, we can expect collateral policy impacts and influences on wide variety of ESG issues. And then finally, as we get better at assessing these risks, better insights will lead to better decisions. And I think we'll better be able to see where the systematic risk lives and be in a better position to address it. And then finally, this has already been addressed by several speakers, this long-term view and long-term discipline is a common denominator across all of these issues. As we'll see a convergence of investment goals and ESG goals when we look at the long horizon, because eventually externalities do get priced in either proactively or after the fact, as in the case of a company blow up. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and thank you, Dr. Gordon, for stimulating so much thinking on our end of the State Investment Board.
Theresa, thank you. Jeff, let's take a couple of minutes away from lunch and give you a chance to respond or thoughts about the last session.
The discussion was terrific, and I really I'm really glad for all of the reactions. And of course, this is a first draft, so there's a ways to go. Let me just respond to three themes that I think were found in many of the comments. One of which, Patrick's point about government, not governance at the firm level, but government. So, you know, it is a deep point that the need for asset managers to think about systematic issues reflects government's failure to do so. Because you're right, I mean, ideally, government would have set up some system that's going to mitigate these various systemic risks precisely because they are systemic. And it would be good governance to mitigate them. But the point is, that's not occurring. And in a way, it brings back to a theme I adverted to at the very beginning, which is the failure is not at only the national level, but at the global level, which is to say, this is a global issue. And ironically, the asset managers, precisely because their investments are international, global, in a way, what I said, it's kind of in half jest that, you know, we're the legislators coming up with a view by which the asset managers can take account of systematic risk or force, in some ways, its mitigation by various disclosure strategies and have the market put pressure on firms. You know, that is, you know, global governance by asset managers in a world in which national governance is flawed and global governance otherwise doesn't exist. So that's a point I want to reflect on more. Pricing point. So this was in a Q&A. Richard Berner made a point about their group in NYU working on this, and I want to follow up on that. And Theresa made the point, and I think, you know, in a way, how would this be applied? And her point is really right, which is to say, all right, you've got a theory by which one could defend a trade-off, but unless you can, in effect, price the trade-off, then how would an asset manager feel it's behaving in a fiduciarily consistent way? And so, therefore, that leads to a reason why the asset managers ought to be pushing for disclosure, both at the governmental level, the market level, and at the firm level, precisely because being able to price these things both can reduce the incidence of them, but also let them make the trade-off when they need to. Third point. So Theresa said that they're hesitant to do a firm-specific trade-off based on systematic risk and expected returns. One of the motivating examples for me was just how important it is to do that with respect to a SIFI. because we have the evidence that the failure of a systemically important financial firm can trigger global financial distress. And so therefore, it's not just a projection about the realization of a systematic risk. We have seen examples and how bad they are. And it seems to me that that might provide, I mean, it's not just that we're looking for the portfolio idea, let's have disclosure rules, but rather when it comes to voting at the firm specific level, should we support an activist hedge fund who wants to have, Goldman Sachs aggressively pursue more of its trading? It seems to me that the Washington State Investment Board is in a position to worry about, based on prior experience, what it would mean to license excess risk taking, given the fact that that in this particular domain, the failure of a significant firm would have systematic effects. It's not just Exxon plus 20 other firms. It's a single firm, the failure of which would have the systematic effect. And you're right that the fine grain in thinking about what this means for firm-specific engagement needs to be better developed. Anyway, I'm very curious when Bill does take back comments or the ideas to some of the group at Vanguard, what their reaction is to it as well. And
Jeff, you want to speed it up?
Get everybody to give me their comments and slides because they're so valuable in my effort to move this thing forward.
Okay, then we're going to now take a lunch break. Be back at a little bit after 1 for our keynote speaker, Leo Strine, a remarkable man who has as many different positions at present as I have in my entire career. So we will get back then.